Welcome back. I'm Francesco and this is Analog Almanac. This is going to be a pretty fun video to make. It's something I've been looking forward to for a little while now. Over the years, a lot of people have been asking me and encouraging me to start making videos on some of the mini cameras that I have in my collection. So I figured now's the time. So today we're going to be looking at the RB Graflex Series B. In particular, we're looking at the 2x3 size, in other words 6x9. So as we get into the video, I'm going to try to touch on a few things. I'm going to provide a little bit of historical context on the camera. I'm going to talk about its operation, how to actually use it. Then I'll offer some reflections on what it's like to actually use the camera, what it's good for, what it's maybe not so great for. And I'll talk a little bit about some interesting things that you can do with it in terms of non-conventional use cases, because these are really fantastic for doing a lot of interesting things with that are outside of the scope of just putting film in the back and using it as it was designed. And then after that, I'll talk about some purchasing considerations that you might want to keep in mind if you end up in the market and looking for one of these cameras. So with that, I'm also going to drop a table of contents into the video description below so that it's easy for you to drill down and find whatever content it is that you're most interested in. All right, so let's get to it. So for some very brief history on the camera, the Graflex SLR box cameras of this design were a very successful long-running line of cameras that were first originally released around 1898 under the Fulmer-Schwig brand. Eventually, during a reorganization, the name of the company was changed to Fulmer Graflex, which is where the Graflex name comes from. This, as I mentioned, is the 2¼ by 3¼ variant of the RB Graflex line. RB stood for revolving back, which was one of the major technological advancements that they eventually built into these cameras. The 2¼ by 3¼ version was first produced around 1923 and ended production around 1952. That's a pretty long run and is a testament to how incredibly well built, useful, and heavily used these cameras really were. These are the predecessors to the famous press cameras that took over popularity in the 1950s, and different versions of this camera in different sizes are credited with taking some of the most important photographs for National Geographic, Life magazine, and a number of other important periodicals of their time. You can date your camera by finding the serial number on it, which you can do by slowly closing the viewing hood, and once this part of the viewing hood folds out of the way, you'll see the serial number right here under the top plate. And so the serial number for this particular camera dates it to around 1949 or 1950. Once you have that serial number, you can compare it to some of the known serial number data charts and get a general idea of when your date of manufacture was for your particular camera. So now to talk about the mechanical operation of the camera and how to actually use it. I've got it all closed down now. This is what's great about these things. They're just like a little box, very easy to carry around. This one doesn't have a back on it right now. I've got a few different backs that fit on this camera on the side here, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But you end up with just this perfect little box, super portable, super easy to get around with. When you open the camera, the first thing you're gonna do is pull that little latch on the front, pull up the top plate, and the viewing hood will automatically open and lock into place for you. You can then turn this knob on the bottom right front of the camera, and the front door will open up and the lens will expand out from the inside of the camera. To go over a little bit about the camera's construction and how it actually operates, I'll give you a sense of what's happening inside, and I'll throw up an old diagram from one of the original manuals to show you what's actually happening inside the camera. So in terms of the parts of the camera, you have this right here, which is your viewing hood. Here in the front, you have the lens assembly, the lens itself, the front standard of the camera, the bellows. That whole assembly is controlled via this knob. Along the top of the inside of the camera here is a ground glass, and that's what you're looking at when you're looking into the camera and focusing on whatever it is that you're photographing. And then diagonally in the camera, when the camera is in viewing position, there's a mirror. And that diagonal mirror is what's taking the image being projected from the lens and moving it up to a right angle and projecting it onto the ground glass so that you can see what you're actually doing. That's how any SLR camera works. When it's time to make the image and the shutter is released, a mechanism releases a spring that allows the mirror to flip up and out of the way. When that mirror is down at the diagonal, the distance that the light travels from the lens to the mirror and then bounces up from the mirror to the ground glass is equal to the distance that light travels when the mirror is up and out of the way, when light travels from the lens through the body of the camera all the way to the film. Those are equal focal lengths. When you look at this side of the camera, you'll see a number of different features. These two are parts of the shutter mechanism. The shutter is first charged by turning this butterfly knob, and then this tensioning knob will apply tension on a spring that will help you set the shutter to exactly what the shutter speed is that you want. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So on this side of the camera, attached to the upper shutter mechanism, is also the mirror return mechanism. To reset the mirror, which you need to do between each exposure, you would take that arm and swing it back down and lock it into place. And that sound was the mirror being reset at a diagonal so that you can view through the camera again. Here you have a little placard on the body of the camera that has a whole little rubric on it that tells you exactly what settings to set the shutter mechanism as well as the tensioning mechanism to in order to achieve the shutter speeds that you want. I've attached a little cold shoe mount there for my own purposes. Sometimes I like to put a small light meter on the side of this. That does not come stock on these cameras. And then when we look at the back of the camera, we have the film plane essentially, and the mechanism that will hold film holders or your roll film holders. This is an old pack film holder. Pack film is now defunct. There might be a few specialty places where you can have some cut and specialty made, but these aren't manufactured anymore. But all the holders work essentially the same way. This is a roll film holder that will make a 6x9 image. And this is a Grafmatic back, which is kind of a super engineered pack film that has septums on the inside. And this allows you to shoot numerous pieces of cut film. And when you pull the dark slide in a certain configuration, it will actually rotate the pieces of film for you so that you don't have to change the film holder between exposures. But so these backs fit onto the back of the camera right here. They attach just like that, very simple. One of the important things to know about this generation of cameras is that they predate a subtle change to the design of film holders that is critical to know, because if you don't get the right kind of film holders, you'll never be able to use them with the camera. They're not cross-compatible. The back of the camera here at the far edge of where the film holder goes, and this is the side that your dark slide would be pointing out of, there's a little ridge. And on newer cameras, that ridge isn't there. It's flat and has a groove in it. And that's the primary difference with this generation of cameras. When you look at the holders, you'll see a groove cut into the top side of the film holder on the side of the dark slide. You'll see a groove there. If you were to compare this to other 6x9 or 6x7 roll film holders, you'll see that instead of a groove, there's a ridge. And on the corresponding camera, there will be a groove for the newer holders, whereas on these older cameras, there's a groove on the holder and a ridge on the camera. This was an earlier design that was later changed because folks realized that putting the groove on the back of the camera meant that over time, with extended use, that groove itself would wear down. And the cost of repairing the camera or buying a new camera or finding the parts to replace that were more when that groove is on the body of the camera as opposed to having that groove on the film holder. If your groove on the film holder was to wear down over time, you could just get another film holder and it doesn't affect the use or operation of the camera. So that was taken into consideration at a certain point, and by the time a lot of the speed graphics and crown graphics and later cameras that used Graflock style backs, they all were changed so that the back had the groove and the film holder had the ridge. That's important to remember when you're looking for film holders for these RB generation cameras and earlier ones. So going back to the back of the camera, the reason they call this the revolving back is because there's a little button right here. And when you depress that little button, it allows you to actually revolve the back of the camera. And that allows you to change from landscape orientation to portrait orientation with ease. And it just turns just like that. It's even easier to do once you have a film holder on the back, but it's just depressing that little button, and then that revolving back turns and then click stops into place. When we turn the camera around to this side, Much more simple on this side. There's not a lot going on, but we do have the shutter release. And so that shutter release gets depressed down. There's a little spring inside the mechanism that will let it return to its top position. But when that shutter release is depressed down, that's what's going to release the mirror that's sitting at the diagonal when you're viewing through the camera. The mirror is going to pop up out of the way. It's going to trip the shutter. The shutter's going to move, and that's what's going to make your exposure. The lenses on this version of the camera are all pretty straightforward. The one that I have on the body is from an older version of the camera. This one's marked as a 5.5-inch lens. 5.5 inches is 139.7 millimeters, so it's roughly a 140 millimeter lens, and it's an f4.5. The aperture ring is just right there on the body of the lens and moves from f4.5 to f32. And this is a Kodak number 31 Anastigmat, f4.5, 5.5 inch. This is the original lens that came on this camera when I received it many years ago. It's a very similar lens design of a newer generation. This one is a Kodak Ektar f4.5 127 millimeter lens. And it works in the same way. There's an aperture ring with its scale on it. This one actually has click stops, whereas the one on the body of the camera does not have click stops. But this one has aperture settings from f4.5 and again to f32. These lenses are very easy to take on and off the camera. You just extend the lens far enough where you can get to it, and then rotate the lens. And once you rotate it enough, it will just detach directly from the body of the camera, and you can swap these out if you wanted to. They're all basically the same lenses, just with some subtle character differences. But if you find one of these cameras that doesn't have a lens, it's easy enough to find a lens that will work for the camera and screw directly onto it. And when you look at the bottom of the camera, you can't see it on mine because I have this quick release plate already attached to it, but at the bottom of the camera right in the center is a 1/4-20 socket. So you can attach this to anything, any kind of quick release plate or tripod mount that will have a standard 1/4-20 screw. When it's time to close up the camera, all you need to do is turn the lens focusing knob so that the lens retracts all the way into the body of the camera, close its little door, and then on the sides of the camera, on both sides, are these little arms positioned at the lower rear of the viewing hood. You press those in so that they buckle, and then the top of the camera is going to want to close, and the viewing hood is naturally just going to fold into position, and you just make sure that it folds up all nice and neatly in there, closes and latches, and you're ready to go. Now let's talk about the shutter and how it actually works in this particular camera, because it's probably the most unique and interesting aspect of this camera design, and it's important to understand because it goes to how you might use the camera, why the camera works the way that it does, and some interesting use cases that you might be able to use it for. So the shutter in this camera is called a focal plane shutter, and that means that instead of having the shutter in the lens, as is more common with modern conventional cameras, the focal plane shutter is actually in the body of the camera at the rear of the camera, and it moves just in front of where the film sits. So the focal plane shutter in this camera is actually a long strip of cloth that has a series of strips cut into it. The cloth is treated in a number of special ways to make it light, tight, and resilient to wear over time. There are 5 different slits in the cloth, each of different widths. So the focal plane shutter is wound up in the camera and is attached to 2 rollers, a top roller that sits about here and a lower roller that sits about here. When the camera is tensioned and the shutter is released, the mirror is tripped and flips up out of the way. The upper roller releases, and the tensioning spring on the lower roller causes the lower roller to spin, and it pulls the shutter down past the film plane and will move one of the slits past the film, allowing a small amount of light to get through in a very timed and precise manner, and that's what's going to make your exposure. The time of the exposure is governed by 2 factors: the width of the slit that it's set to and the tension set for the shutter tensioner. So here's a quick view of how the focal plane shutter actually works. The camera is tensioned. There's no film holder on the back, obviously, so that you can see that. And so now you see the focal plane shutter cloth is here blocking light from the lens. When I depress the shutter release, the mechanism that I described previously will activate, and you'll see the focal plane shutter move down, and one of the slits will pass by this opening. And you saw that happen pretty quickly. So with that focal plane shutter, there are 4 working apertures. Those are what the slits are referred to. There are 4 working apertures and 6 tension settings that can be used in combination to achieve different shutter exposure times. If you look at the shutter exposure speed placard on the body of the camera, you'll see going horizontally across the top of the camera, A, B, C, and D, which corresponds to the 4 different slits or apertures in the focal plane shutter. And then going down, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, which correspond to the 6 different tension settings that you can set for each of those individual apertures. And that'll give you a total combination of 24 different shutter speeds that the camera is capable of achieving, from 1/10 of a second to 1/1000th of a second. And when you really take into consideration the age of a camera like this and kind of how primitive the design is, it's incredible that a camera like this is able to achieve that range of shutter speeds. And the reality is that these are incredibly precise, and focal plane shutters will typically last longer than almost any other type of shutter design. And these cameras have proven that to be true. One thing to be aware of is that some older versions of the camera have a different shutter speed placard. This is the more modern placard that uses the combination sequence using letters and numbers, but there's an older version that will have the number sequence for the tensioning numbers, but instead of numbers, it'll actually have fractional numbers, and those fractional numbers correspond to the actual width of the slits in the curtain apertures. At a certain point in time, Graflex just understood that it was easier to understand the system if the sequence was just a combination of numbers and letters. There wasn't really a huge value for the end user to understand that, oh, this is the 1/8 aperture and this is the 3/4 aperture. It was just easy to understand aperture A, aperture B, aperture C, aperture D. So if you get an older version of the camera, you may end up having that older placard, but it works in the same way. And the combinations as they appear in the different windows are essentially the same functions. They're just labeled differently. So to use the focal plane shutter, the first thing that you need to do is to make sure that the mirror return arm is set to the back position. And that's this arm right here that you take and you just move it to the back position if it's already not there. The focal plane shutter cannot move or be set if the mirror return is in the forward position. When the mirror arm is in the correct position, you're going to use the wing knob on the shutter aperture or slit control, and you're going to turn that counterclockwise. When you turn this knob, it'll reach a click stop, and every other click stop corresponds to a letter that will appear in the little window right here. And then those letters correspond to the letters that you see on the shutter speed placard, A, B, C, and D. As you continue to turn this knob counterclockwise, you'll see in the back of the camera that that's one of the slits. That's one of the apertures for the shutter. And so each 2 clicks will move a slit up and out of the way. So I turn again, there's another slit right there, a more narrow slit. And I'll turn it again, and that's up out of the way. As you continue to turn that knob, you're going to bring progressively narrower aperture slits up onto the top roller, and each of those slits corresponds to a progressively faster shutter speed. If you happen to go past the slit that you wanted to use, there's actually a little arm that sits right here vertically on the far edge of the aperture control mechanism. And that little arm can be pulled toward the back of the camera, and it will move the shutter back to the previous wider slit for you. So I'm on aperture C, I do that, and now I'm on aperture B. Now I'd move on to tensioning the shutter using the lower shutter control mechanism or the tensioning mechanism. There's also a little window in that that's going to show you a number, and that number corresponds to the numbers that you're going to see on the shutter speed placard. So again, the window on the top aperture control mechanism is going to show you letters, and the window on the lower tensioning mechanism is going to show you numbers. The lowest tension number that this can be set to is number 1, which is what it's at right now. And when I turn the knob, it's going to click, and every other click will correspond to a number. When you turn this, you'll also notice that this little silver button here, and it might not be silver on your camera, but there will be a button, it will move and kind of click into place. This is the release for the tension. So if you go past the tension that you wanted to use, so now I'm one click past 4, which doesn't show a number in the window, it's kind of in an in-between state. So if I want to go back to number 4, I just push that button to the side and I'm back at number 4. If I wanted to go to number 3, I'm going to push that button toward the back of the camera twice to get it to go first to the intermediate step in between 4 and 3, and then back down to 3. So right now, the tension is set at number 4, one click, another click, and now I'm at tension 3. So the knob will wind on to progressively higher tensions, and pushing that button back toward the rear of the camera will release tension. Now, if I want to use the camera to make a timed exposure, which you would use for making a long exposure, you're going to want to do basically the same thing you did before. You're going to move the mirror return down into the charged position, and in this case, we're already set up for it. There's a T that appears in that window, and that T means that the shutter is charged, and when it's tripped, it's going to be left open in order to make a time exposure. When it's tripped and is in the open position, that letter is going to change to an O. But so when I go ahead and I trip the shutter, and in this case, for timed exposures, the tension doesn't matter. But I'm going to go ahead and act like I was making the exposure, and you'll see the shutter open up. And so that's going to remain open for as long as I want it to, until I manually close it. And the way that you manually close it is you just use that same mirror return arm, and you push it down toward the back of the camera, and it's going to move the mirror down into the charged position, which is what's going to block light. And now you're in a position where you can reset the shutter to whatever speed you want to use. So as a quick run through of what it would actually be like to use this camera in practice, as if I was going to make an exposure right now, I'm going to run through the steps that I just described in sequence so you can see what the experience of shooting it would actually be like. So I've got the camera all opened up and ready to go. I've got a roll film holder attached to the back of the camera. So what I would do is I would go and I would look at whatever the scene is that I want to photograph. I'd take my light meter, I'd go ahead and I'd meter the light. Let's say the light meter told me that I want to use f8 at a 1/25th of a second. So I'm going to go back to the camera, and the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the lens down since it's wide open for viewing right now, and I'm going to set the lens to f8, and then I'm going to consult my shutter exposure table on the body of the camera and make sure that I set the focal plane shutter as well as the tensioning speed to the correct combination so that I get that 1/25th of a second exposure that my meter tells me that I want. So I'm going to first go ahead and make sure that the mirror return is in the down and back position so that I can set the shutter. And when I consult the table, it tells me that to get a 1/25th of a second, I need to be at curtain aperture B and a tension of number 5. So right now I happen to be at curtain aperture A and tension number 3. So I'm going to need to change both of those. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rotate the curtain aperture control until the letter B appears in the window. And then I'm going to turn the tensioning knob until the number 5 appears in the window. And so now I have a curtain aperture of B set and a shutter tension of number 5 set. And that's going to correspond, once again, B5 on the table on the side of the camera will give me a 1/25th of a second shutter exposure time. So now I go back and I return to my scene. I make sure that nothing's moved and that it's still focused. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to remove my dark slide. I'm going to move my thumb over to the shutter release, and when I'm ready, I'm going to release the shutter. And that was the shutter being released. The mirror moved up and out of the way, and the curtain moved past the film at the corresponding curtain aperture and tension. And that gave me a 1/125th of a second exposure time. I'm going to go ahead and put my dark slide back in. And so now I could go ahead and advance my film to the next frame, make my next shot, fold up the camera, do whatever I want to do. So that's what it would look like to make an exposure with the RB Graflex 2¼ by 3¼ revolving back Series B camera. Okay, so I told you I would give you some thoughts and reflections on what it's been like to use this camera, what's good, what's maybe not so great, and some ideas around maybe some unconventional type things that you might want to do with it that it's actually really well set up to do. I really love this camera. I've had this particular camera for probably 10 years. I've modified it several times for different purposes, and it's just been a workhorse. It's been really fantastic. It's a go-to for me. I really enjoy it because depending on the lens that you have on it, and all the lenses that come on these cameras are great lenses for their age and their generation. These cameras can be set up with all kinds of different lenses. As long as the lens has a focal length that is equal to or greater than the minimum focal length that the camera is capable of supporting, then it can be used. That minimum focal length is not just determined by the distance from the lens to the film plane. It's actually determined by the ability of the lens to focus at infinity with the mirror in the down viewing position. If you use a lens that's too short, that needs to go too far into the body of the camera, then when it comes time to make the exposure, the mirror is going to try to move up out of the way and it's going to hit the lens, which is not the result that you want, and it won't be able to work. So there are some slight differences depending on the model and version of the camera in terms of the minimum focal length, but as long as you have a lens that's either that minimum focal length or longer, you'll be able to use it. I had a 4x5 version of the same camera that actually had a massive 900mm lens attached to it with a 3-foot long extension tube. It had a custom extended bed that was used to support that massive lens. The camera was actually used for sports journalism back in the 30s in San Francisco. It was a really cool camera, but it gives you an idea of the extreme types of modifications that you can actually do to these things to get them to do whatever it is that you want. The experience of shooting the camera is interesting. I find it quite pleasurable. Some people might not. It's a little bit larger of a camera in terms of handheld cameras, if that's what you're used to. I've been shooting large and ultra large format cameras for many, many years, all the way up to 20x24. So this to me is still a small camera. And definitely still a hand camera. But if you're used to small little point and shoot cameras, or maybe you've been shooting a Nikon F for years or a Leica and you're used to a very small camera, this is definitely going to be larger. But it's also a medium format camera. It makes a larger negative. It makes a 6x9 or 2¼ by 3¼ negative, which is a really good size negative. And so for the size of the image that it's capable of making, it's not really that big of a camera. And it's also very lightweight. Because of its wood construction, it's considerably lighter weight than you would actually ever expect it to be. I think it may actually be lighter. Oh wow, yeah. This is actually lighter than this Mamiya C330 6x6 camera. That's incredible. Look at the size difference. This camera is heavier than this camera. So in terms of use, I don't really find that it fatigues me in particular. It's easy to move around with, and it's nowhere near as cumbersome as you might find it to be. Using the camera itself, it takes a little bit of getting used to figure out how to hold the camera and manipulate the controls while using it. That definitely takes a little bit of use. Becoming familiar with the controls and how to get to them relatively fast enough is definitely a thing. This is not going to be a particularly fast camera to use. It's a camera that you have to be aware of how it works, and you have to be of the understanding that you might miss a shot here and there if you're chasing things, because you got to do that whole process of focusing the camera, getting a sense of where it is, metering your light, going through and setting the shutter speed via multiple different controls on the camera, consulting the shutter speed scale if you're not totally familiar with what combinations you're using, and then going back, focusing again, releasing the shutter, and then you got to go through all those steps again to make the next shot. So it's not the fastest camera by any means, but depending on what you want to do, it can still be a real joy to use. I've never found any of those things to be particularly prohibitive in its use, and I still love using the camera. Some other ideas, again, going back to the pack film holder, or even in the case of the Grafmatic holder, you can shoot paper negatives out of this thing, which is a lot of fun. I did that for years. You could put a single paper negative into a pack film holder, so you could use it for collodion. You could shoot wet plates out of this if you were to cut the glass plates down to size. But so you've got a pack film holder, you just pop your plate into the pack film holder. I've got a little piece of foam that works to apply pressure onto the back of my plate or paper to hold it in place. I put that there, but then it just closes up, and when I want to make an exposure, it's right there and it's ready to go, and it works perfectly for me. If you want to use paper negatives, you could do that with the pack film holder. These are very cheap and easy to get a hold of online because there's no pack film anymore, so people just have these holders sitting around. Again, Grafmatic film holder. This is a really cool device. It has this whole double dark slide system, and it's got these septums on the inside here, and the septums rotate when you go through a certain sequence of closing the slides on this. You can load that up with several sheets of photographic paper and go out with a really portable, really low profile setup. Look at that on the camera. Easy to put on the camera, super low profile, doesn't make it particularly larger. Really incredible, really incredible. You can use cut sheet film with that if you want to cut down your sheet film. You can use the paper negatives like I said. It's very, very, very capable. And you can do a lot with it. It's a lot of fun to use. Okay, so some final thoughts for anyone who might be looking for one of these cameras. There are a few things that you're going to want to be aware of and think about to make sure that you get a good camera or one that's going to work for what you want to use it for. The first of those being, remember this is an old camera, and it has a focal plane shutter that is a piece of cloth. It's a piece of fabric that's been treated in order to be light tight. That means if you get a camera that wasn't stored well, if it was stored in a hot garage for the past 60 years or something like that, it's going to be very dry and things are going to be very brittle. And that's very common with these cameras. You're going to find more examples of these cameras that were stored improperly, and the focal plane shutter is not going to work. It's going to be old and decrepit and dried and brittle and cracked, and it may not turn at all. Always ask the seller what the condition of that shutter is. With that said, if you're buying this camera because you want to use it for a process that you maybe wouldn't need the focal plane shutter for, meaning you're not shooting modern speed film, again, you might want to use it to shoot little collodion plates in it, or you might want to shoot paper negatives. In those cases, you're going to be working with almost exclusively slow shutter speed times, meaning the time setting. In that case, you don't need a working focal plane shutter. And you might be able to find one of these for really cheap because it wasn't stored properly and it doesn't have a working shutter. If that's something that you want to consider, that could be a great idea. I've known people who've bought these for exactly that purpose, and they've used them happily over the years because all they really needed in order to make the exposure was just a working mirror mechanism rather than the focal plane shutter. So that's a thing to think about. If you do want to shoot film with it, or anything with modern speeds, then you're going to need a working focal plane shutter. You want to make sure that the shutter is in good condition. You want to make sure that it's supple. If you get the camera or you see in the pictures and it looks super dry, or you see cracks in it, or it's described as brittle, that's not going to be a working shutter, and you're going to have to replace it. There aren't many people who will do work on these cameras. They're not particularly difficult to do work on if you're someone who's good at that sort of thing and you're mechanically inclined. But overall, it's just easier to start out with a camera that's going to work well and is in good condition. So make sure that the focal plane shutter is not dried out, it's not brittle, it's not cracked, and it's nice and supple, and it moves through all of the different settings. Another thing to be aware of is the tensioner. That tensioner control works by a spring, and if it was left stored for 60 or 70 years at the highest tension, over those decades it will have fatigued that tensioning spring, and the tensioner is not going to work with the same force that it would had it been stored properly in the first place. That's a good note, actually. When you store this camera for long periods of time, go ahead and release the tension on both the focal plane shutter as well as the tensioner, and you will extend the life of both of those mechanisms exponentially. But so if the camera wasn't stored properly, or it was stored under tension for decades, those springs are going to be worn out. They're going to need to be retensioned or torsioned, or they're going to need to be replaced entirely. So that's something to think about as well. Whoever you're buying the camera from, it's worth asking them whether or not they've tested it, if they're familiar with the camera at all. Maybe even send them this video so they can test it out for you to get a sense of whether or not the shutter speeds are actually working, if they sound relatively accurate. Unfortunately, most people selling these cameras are finding them at garage sales or estate sales. They haven't had the camera serviced. They're going to have no idea how to actually test those things. So it's a matter of getting the camera with some type of money-back guarantee or return window if you can. That's a really great idea, because then you can get it and you can check it out and test everything out, see if the shutter speeds and the tensions and everything work the way you expect them to, and then go from there. Another thing to be aware of is on the lens side of the camera, you want to make sure that your bellows are in really good condition.
That's also an easy way to get a sense of what the condition of the focal shutter will likely be like. If you can see that the bellows are all bad and messed up and cracked and brittle, you can bet the focal plane shutter is going to be in similar condition. So you'll want to check for that as well and make sure that you get a camera that has a good supple bellows on it. Some of these cameras over the years have just kind of settled with gunk and grime and dirt and dust in the gear mechanism, and that can end up making it a little difficult to focus. If you find that the focus is particularly stiff, and again, you're okay with taking things apart and putting them back together, it's easy to disassemble to clean out those gears and the teeth on the track, and it'll move super smooth for you. Again, probably easier just to find one that works the way that you want it to work. And then the other consideration is the condition of the viewing hood. It's really common to find these with a totally messed up viewing hood. Again, same things that I talked about before. If it was stored improperly, the viewing hood's going to be messed up. It's going to be dry, it's going to be cracked, it's going to be brittle. So you want to look and make sure that you have a good viewing hood. You can actually find really nice replacement, in some cases old stock original viewing hoods, and in some cases ones that are newly manufactured. There's a few people on eBay who sell them, so you can check that out if you need a replacement viewing hood. In some cases you can also find bellows replacements as well. It's a little bit harder to find focal plane shutter replacements, and if you have one that needs to be replaced, you may have to make that yourself, which is a bit involved. That's all I got for you, at least about this camera for now. I've probably forgotten a number of different things. Feel free to drop me some questions in the comments below. If you have one of these little guys and you have experience with it, let me know what that experience has been like. I'd love to hear about how you use it, what you use it for, maybe how you fixed it up or anything like that. So drop a comment below. I hope you'll also consider subscribing to my channel. So with that, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video.